All right, we're good. Just wasn't responding. Um, welcome. It's good to see everybody. Yeah, it's my turn in the rotation for song leading. I'm on the other side of a headache right now, so if I'm a little run down, that's why, because I was fighting a headache up until this point. Um, so it's for that reason we're keeping it simple tonight as far as songs go. I decided we'd just do the medley, the fellowship medley, as it's called, from beginning with 703. Um, and we're just going to sing 703, 704, and 705 all together. And then Matt will have our opening prayer. So again, that's beginning with 703, going through 705. And so, I love you with the love of the Lord. I love you with the love of the Lord. I see in you the glory of my King, and I love you with the love of the Lord. Please love me with the love of the Lord. Please love me with the love of the Lord. If you want to do God's will, then the need you must fulfill is to love me with the love of the Lord. He loves me with the love of the Lord. He loves me with the love of the Lord. My debts were all paid when he rose up from the grave, and he loves me with the love of the Lord. Bind us together, Lord, bind us together with cords that cannot be broken. Bind us together, Lord, bind us together, Lord, bind us together with love. There is only one God. There is only one King. There is only one body. That is why we can sing. Bind us together, Lord, bind us together with cords that cannot be broken. Bind us together, Lord, bind us together, Lord, bind us together with love. 705. A common love for each other, a common gift to the Savior, common bond holding us to the Lord, a common strength when we're weary, a common hope for tomorrow, common joy in the truth of God's word. All right. Oh, that was louder than I thought it was going to be. All right. I promised simplicity on the songs. I'm not promising you that when it comes to things we're going to be studying tonight. Let's open up to Mark chapter 9. It's where we're at in Mark's gospel right now. That's Mark chapter 9. Now, here in Mark chapter 9, I've mentioned we're kind of moving into a new section of Mark's gospel. Everything before chapter 9 really dealt with the public ministry of Jesus, and we still see some of that in chapter 9, but what we're more specifically seeing is Jesus' dealings with his apostles as he's preparing them for the crucifixion event that he's already spoken on to some degree up to this point in Mark's gospel. So this record of those things begins with Mark recording first in verses 1 through 13 of this chapter the event of the transfiguration that we talked about last week, where he took Peter, James, and John up on the mountain. He was transfigured before them. Moses and Elijah were there, and one thing he said to Peter, James, and John, basically, don't tell anyone about this until after he'd been resurrected. So that's verses 1 through 13. As we reach verse 14, they come back down from the mountain, and the text says, when they came back to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and some scribes arguing with them. We'll pause with that. So again, Jesus, Peter, James, and John, they've come back from the mountain. And what's going on there in verse 14? Who are they arguing with? Okay, the crowd's arguing, yes. And there's also these scribes. Exactly, they're arguing with the disciples. Jesus, Peter, James, and John, they come back down from the mountain. Large crowd there. And there's the other 9 apostles there. And they're having this argument with not just the crowd, but there's also present are the scribes. Can anyone remind me who the scribes are? Okay, yeah, that was their job. They copied down the written word. That's true. So since that's true, they were among also the religious leaders. There was the scribes and also the Pharisees. Here it's just the scribes that are present. So they're engaged in some kind of argument with the other disciples. And that's all verse 14 tells us. Mark does not record the nature of this argument. He just tells us that this is going on. Anything else on verse 14? Okay. So having recorded what he did in verse 14, in verse 15, Mark goes on to use one of his favorite words, immediately, that we've talked about. And he says there, lost my place, there. Immediately, when the entire crowd saw him, they were amazed and began running up to greet him. So again, Peter, James, and John and Jesus, they come back down from the mountain. They saw this argument going on. But what happens when they see Jesus and the others? Well, that's verse 16. We'll get there. But what happens here in verse 15? They were amazed and ran up to greet them. Now, let me ask this question. Verse 14, there's the argument there. What could the argument have been about based on what we read here in verse 15? Okay, you might say whether or not Jesus is going to be there or not. Again, we don't know specifically, but based on the crowd's response to when they see Jesus, we can assume it had something to do with Jesus. Again, Mark doesn't tell us, but it's still something we need to bear in mind, that it probably had something to do with Jesus and his apostles. And so they're talking about Jesus. Hey, look, there he is. Let's go say hello. So that's verse 15. I'm putting it very simply, but anything else on verse 15? Uh-huh. That is the question. What were they amazed at? And that's why we asked the question about what the argument was about. It had something to do with Jesus. It's an assumption we almost have to make. It, maybe, but one thing we've talked about during the transfiguration is he came back to looking normal. It wasn't like what happened with Moses. He didn't come down the mountain with his face shining. So, yeah, Jeremiah, go ahead. Yeah. That's a possibility as well, because yes, there's a lot of parallels between Exodus and what happened on the Mount with the Transfiguration. One thing we do know about what happened on Exodus, people that were at the bottom of the mountain while Moses was up with God, they could definitely see some stuff going on the mountain. They didn't know what. So that's possible here, that the people did see something going on the mountain, but they wouldn't know what until after the resurrection. So that's a possibility here, that they were amazed that Jesus was involved in something on the mountain that involved God. I hadn't thought of that, but that is an excellent point, that this is possible here. Anything else on verse 15? All right. So this brings us into verse 16. Mark records Jesus' response to what's going on. The text says, and he asked them, what are you discussing with them? So what's happened here in verse 16? What does Jesus say? What's everyone talking about? Exactly. He asked the apostles, aside from Peter, James, and John, what are you talking about with these people? With the crowd, more specifically with the scribes. In other words, he wants to know what is the subject of this seeming argument, or we might say debate, that was going on. Anything else on verse 16? Okay. Now verses 14 through 16, they're these what I like to call stage setting verses, because it's this question, it's this argument, this debate that's gone on, and this question that Jesus asked that sets the stage for what we're going to look at in verses 17 through 29, where we do find out more about what was being discussed as Jesus, Peter, James, and John were on the mountain. More specifically, what we're going to find out is that this discussion or debate that was being had revolved around the apostles' ability or lack thereof to cast out an unclean spirit from a young boy who was brought by his father to the apostles, to Jesus and the apostles. So in short, what Mark does in verses 17 through 29 is make 3 points about what the crowd was discussing in regard to Jesus and his apostles as it applies to this young boy with the unclean spirit. First point, in verses 17 through 19, one thing we find out is that the crowd was discussing that the apostles could not cast out the unclean spirit from the boy. Second point, in verses 20 through 25, is that the crowd was discussing whether or not Jesus could cast out the unclean spirit from the boy. Finally, in verses 26 through 29, the third point is that the crowd was discussing if the boy was dead after the unclean spirit was cast out. So after looking at these things then, what we will learn from these verses is that in our conversations, even with each other, we must learn to discuss Jesus and his apostles. We'll talk about that when we get there. But let's read verses 17 through 29, and then we'll look at the points. Again, Mark chapter 9, beginning in verse 17, the text says, and one of the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son possessed with a spirit which makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and stiffens out. I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it." And he answered them and said, "O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me." They brought the boy to him. When he saw him, immediately the spirit threw him into a convulsion, and falling to the ground, he began rolling around and foaming at the mouth. And he asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. It has often thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the boy's father cried out and said, "I do believe. Help my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was rapidly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You deaf and mute spirit, I command you, come out of him, and do not enter him again." After crying out and throwing him into terrible convulsions, it came out, and the boy became so much like a corpse that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him, and he got up. When he came into the house, his disciples began questioning him privately, "Why could we not drive it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot come out by anything but prayer." Okay, so we're looking at what this crowd was discussing. Everything from 17 through 29 builds on Jesus' question from verse 16. But one thing they were talking about is the apostles' inability to cast out the unclean spirit from the boy. Verse 17 sets the stage, another stage-setting verse. We're introduced to this boy's father. What does he say? As a mute spirit, or the text says possessed with a spirit which makes him mute. That's how the New American Standard reads. So what kind of spirit is this according to this statement? It's a spirit that cannot speak. So what happens when that spirit possesses this boy? What happens to the boy? He can't speak. Now we're going to see more of what it does to him here in just a minute, but that's one thing it does. It does not speak. Now, furthermore, what is also suggested in this verse is that this was another case of demon possession. The word demon is not used here, but that's what it is. And this demon is preventing this boy from being able to speak. Anything else on verse 17? All right. So having made this point, the response of the father does not stop there. What else does the father say in verse 18? Okay. And how does he end that statement? What does he say about the apostles? They could not cast it out. So we're looking at something else this spirit does to this boy. When you read what it does, what event does it sound like? A seizure. That's exactly what this sounds like. So not only is this spirit causing this boy not to speak, it's basically causing him to have seizures. Because that's what this language is. Looking at it from an objective standpoint. But the Father does add, I told the apostles, I told your disciples, Jesus, to cast it out. They couldn't do it. We're going to look at why in just a few minutes. So this is seizure language that he's doing. If you've ever seen someone have a seizure, this is exactly what happens in some cases. This hits very close to home for me because, as you guys know, I have a seizure disorder that's under control with medication. But I've seen seizures happen. I know at least some of you in here have seen seizures happen. This is what happens. Now, what we're going to find out is that what this demon is doing is much more violent than a typical seizure, but this is part of what's happening, because in verse 22 we read, it throws this boy into the fire and water, attempting to destroy him, but we'll get there. But part of the point the Father is making here is not only what this spirit is doing, but also making the point, Jesus, your disciples could not cast it out. So that's verse 18. Anything else on verse 18? Yeah, I know we're moving kind of quickly, but it's how we're going to roll tonight. So verse 19, Jesus' response. What does he say? Okay. So based on those words, what picture does Jesus' response paint? How is he feeling about this? Okay? Okay? That's exactly what he's saying. They're lacking faith. Now, what does that tell us at this point? Why the apostles could not cast this demon out? Why couldn't they do it?
Why didn't find they could?
They didn't think they could. There was some degree of faith. Jeremiah?
They still don't believe he's the Messiah.
They being the apostles? Okay.
They have not figured it out yet that he is. They think he's that earthly king, that he's coming to be king. He's no different than a prophet. They have not figured out that he is God incarnate.
Right. That's true. They haven't reached that understanding. And since that's true, there's a certain degree of a lack of faith, even in the apostles. And we're going to see that this is a lot of the reason that they could not cast this demon out. It's not the whole reason. We'll find that out, but it's a big part of the reason. So, Jesus is frustrated. That's why he says what he says here. He's frustrated at the lack of faith. How long shall I put up with you? And so what does he do? What does he command here? Bring the boy here. The American Standard has bring him to me, but that is what he's saying. Bring the boy here. Now, just to put this in our heads a little bit more, have you ever had a situation where you ask somebody to do something for you and they just can't do it and you get frustrated and say, oh, I'll just do it? You ever had that experience? That's how Jesus is feeling. Oh, I'll just do it. Bring him to me. This is frustration that he's expressing. Anything else on verse 19?
He's not just frustrated at his disciples. He's frustrated at the scribes, the boy's father, with everybody across the board. He's frustrated with all of them because they're lacking faith.
That is true. And we know that because he says unbelieving generation. He doesn't specify a certain person. He talks about the whole generation. So that's a very valid point that Jeremiah makes. Anything else on verse 19? Okay. So putting verses 17 through 19 together, one thing we know the crowd was discussing, it was about the apostles' inability to cast the unclean spirit out. And we've already found out that a lot of the reason they could not is because of the lack of faith. So Jesus takes it upon himself. He will cast out the spirit. That brings us into verses 20 through 25. So this point is introduced in verse 20. The boy is brought to Jesus. What happens in verse 20? Okay? So the spirit sees Jesus. And basically, this boy goes into another seizure. Now, just by way of review of things we've studied up to this point, in other cases of demon possession before this point, when demons saw Jesus, what happened before with other demon possessions? They recognized who he was and say who he was. That doesn't happen here. Why doesn't that happen here from the context? It's a mute spirit. So he sees Jesus. This spirit knows who he is, but it's a mute spirit. So he doesn't say something. Instead, this spirit does what he's been doing to this boy, throwing him into a seizure, convulsions, falling on the ground, rolling around, foaming at the mouth. Guy? Right. So, yeah, and that's true. He does recognize Jesus for who he is, who he really is. Anything else on verse 20? Okay. So how does Jesus respond in verse 21? How long has this been happening? He's not frustrated this time. He sees what's going on. And what's the Father say? From childhood. So Jesus wants to know how long. The Father says since childhood. So since the Father does respond in this way, this boy that we're looking at isn't necessarily a little boy, but might be somewhere closer to the teenage years at this point. It's been happening for a long time, is the point. Anything else on verse 21? Okay. So having answered Jesus' question, in verse 22, we find some more words about what the Spirit is doing to this boy. What else is the Spirit doing to this boy in verse 22? For what purpose? To destroy. He's begging Jesus for help. But going back to the Spirit, what it's doing to him, what's the Spirit, simply put, trying to do? To kill him. The text says to destroy, that's true. But the Spirit's looking to kill this boy. For reasons we don't know. I mean, we can speculate on that, but we're not going to do that today. But yes, this Spirit's intention is to kill this boy. So naturally the Father says, Jesus, if you can do anything, take pity on us, help us. If there's something you can do, have this compassion toward us. So it's here where we're seeing that this boy, it's more than just your typical seizure. This is in very real sense the Spirit taking hold of him, throwing him into a seizure for the purpose of killing him. Now again, we know that because the word destroy does come from a word that in this context means to kill. Now something else we should understand from this verse is that the man's request that he makes at the end of this verse and what he says in verse 24 suggests that the man had some degree of doubt as to whether or not Jesus himself could cast out this unclean spirit. So here's where we're seeing the lack of faith aspect of this story. Anything else on verse 22? All right. So how does Jesus respond in verse 23? Yes, yeah. Right. There's a tone of frustration here, not as vividly as it was in the other verse, but there's a tone of frustration. If you can, seriously, all things are possible to him who believes. What's another way to put that statement? Well, verse 23, the all things are possible to him who believes. What's another way to put that? Have faith. Jeremiah?
Get rid of who believes. The Greek and the original and the oldest manuscript does not say who believes. It says, if you can, all things are possible from the one. That's it. So Christ said, I can do all things. They added that after the fact.
I did not know that.
That the oldest three manuscripts do not have who believes in it, and they actually have it in brackets.
The New American Standard does not note that.
22 does.
Okay, I do not have the 2022. So, Matt, you have the newer New American Standard. Do you have anything different there in verse 23? Okay. Says what Jeremiah said. See, I have that note. I just don't have anything that about. Okay, yeah, that's the note I don't have, is the oldest manuscript. So that's new information for me. So thank you for that.
I mean, it would make sense, though, that he says your lack, and it goes back to that lack of faith.
Right.
And he's making a statement. The one, all things are possible through the one. And
Right.
like punctuating what he's trying to teach people would make more sense.
Exactly. So it's through him. We talk about through faith. Well, faith in who? In the one, Jesus. So this is just further showing that a lack of faith is a lot of the reason people were having trouble with this spirit. The apostles having trouble casting it out, in other words. So this is a statement that has a sense that everything is possible through Jesus. Now that's important to remember, because reading Jesus' words by themselves out of context creates a temptation to believe that Jesus' words means, well, I can perform miracles. Jeannie is sick, I can make her well because I believe. That's what Jesus' words mean out of context. But in context, they mean anything is possible through the power of Jesus, not our power. I want us to keep that in mind, because that's going to come in a few verses. Anything else on verse 23? Makes sense so far? Okay. So how does the Father respond in verse 24? I do believe, help my unbelief. What is that statement about?
Contradictory.
Okay, explain that, Don.
Well, if the first statement, I believe, and then it says, help my unbelief.
Uh-huh.
That would have been, anyway, it's the opposite of what it should be.
Okay. Somebody else help us with that statement. Okay.
Well, he either believes or doesn't believe. Or he has partial belief.
Okay, I have two hands up. Guy?
I see him saying, I believe that you're physically who you are, but I need help in believing what that you can do.
Okay, that's might be it. Jeremiah, you had your hand up.
It goes back to that lack of faith. The disciples know he's something, and he's a prophet, but they don't have complete faith that he is the Messiah, that he is God incarnate.
That
Just the fact they believe he's a good person.
Okay? Those are all pieces to this puzzle. So Jeremiah made the statements, and forgive me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a incomplete faith. I'm just kind of paraphrasing there. That's true. But I'm going to bring this a little closer to home for us. And I'm just going to read straight what I got in my notes here. But Mark is recording what's been called the Father's famously paradoxical reply. It is a contradictory statement. But as one commentator puts it, this Father's statement here, and I quote, captures the tortured self-doubt of many sincere prayers. I'm pausing with that. And going on with the quote, which shows that belief and unbelief are mixed in all of us. Most of us, if not all of us, I should say. You ever prayed something and you prayed it with all your heart, but there's still some doubt that creeps in? That's what this statement is about. You do have faith, but the doubt is still kind of there. Out of a lot of statements in the Bible, this is one of the ones I relate to most. I can put myself in the Father's shoes in this verse. I do believe. Lord, help my unbelief. I think we'd be lying to say that we've never doubted in our faith. I have. I see a lot of heads nodding yes, that you have too. So yes, this is a contradictory statement by itself, but it's a statement that expresses a truth. That even in the midst of faith, there is still doubt. And this man is coming to Jesus, help me with my doubt. I have faith, Lord, but I also have doubt. Help me with that. So it's faith and doubt mixed. It's a strange concept, but it's still a truth. That faith and doubt are there together. So that's your sermon on verse 24. Anything else? Okay. Right. Right. Exactly. Now, putting this a little bit more in context, we need to remember that before this point, this man has seen the apostles aren't able to do anything. So his faith has kind of been shaken, for the lack of a better term. So now Jesus is brought. He's made this statement, all things are possible through the one or who believes. And so now this man has reached that point where he does believe, and he wants that help with any lingering unbelief. Yeah. Absolutely. Faith grows. Anything else on verse 24? So we still got some ground to cover. All right. Verse 25. What happens next? And what? Okay. So this crowd, it's growing again. So Jesus quickly, the text doesn't use quickly, but it seems like he does this pretty quickly. You deaf and mute spirit, I command you, come out of him and do not enter again. So here's my question. Why add, do not enter him again? Okay, that's another passage that is pertinent to this. I can't remember exactly. I know which one you're talking about, Sandy, but I can't remember exactly where it's found. But yes, Jesus adds this because it was possible that even after a demon was cast out, it could come back. But Jesus says, don't come back. Now, if demons, as we've talked about before, they are under the authority of Jesus. They have no choice but to listen to what Jesus says. They fought against what Jesus said, but at the end of the day, they still had to do it. So when Jesus says these words, this demon knows, I ain't coming back to this boy. Anything else on verse 25? Okay. So again, we're looking at this question. What was the crowd discussing? Verses 20 through 25. The crowd was discussing whether or not Jesus could cast the unclean spirit from the boy. There was some degree of doubt in the people as to whether or not Jesus could do this, but Jesus does it. And the father had asked for help with his unbelief, and he cast the spirit out, showing people that he could. So that brings us into verses 26 through 29. The spirit's been cast out. The next topic of discussion is the boy dead. And we see that there beginning in verse 26. What happens there in verse 26? Okay. So what does the spirit do there in verse 26? Okay. That is a good question to ask of this verse. I thought this was a mute spirit. Why is he crying out? Now, something we know about mute people to help us answer this question, they can't speak, but they can still make sounds. That seems to be what's going on here, is this demon made some sort of sound. Not necessarily words, but a sound. Does that help answer your question, Dia? And so he makes this sound, probably a pretty horrible one, is my guess. And then he throws this boy into one last seizure before he leaves. But this is the spirit fighting against what Jesus told him to do. Doesn't fight with words, he fights with what he's already done. But the end result is it comes out. And how's the boy left? They assumed he was dead. Why? Okay. He'd been through a pretty violent circumstance, but now the spirit's gone. How is he appearing?
I'd say he was exhausted, by the way.
Okay. Andrea, go ahead. Okay. All right. Guy, go ahead. That's true. But yeah, this boy, he's been going through Lord knows how many seizures. Very violent life in that respect. Now that spirit's gone, he's very still. Perhaps for a moment, maybe. So that's a possibility up until Jesus does what he does. But the picture being painted here is that this boy was very still. Up to this point, he'd been going through a series of seizures, convulsions, everything that goes with it. Now he's still. And he looks dead. Maybe he was for a moment. We don't know that for sure. But what does Jesus do in verse 27? Took him by the hand and raised him up. Then what does the boy do? He got up. He wasn't dead at that point. So, Jesus brought him out of this apparently exhausted, very still condition. And the boy gets up. And he's back to his normal self after this long and violent battle with demon possession. Anything else on verses 26 or 27? Okay. So this series of events with the boy is all brought to a close. Verse 28, Jesus goes back to whatever house he was staying in, and what do the apostles start asking? How come we couldn't take him out? Jesus, why couldn't we? You did it, Jesus. How come we couldn't? Now, in addition to that, something else we should understand from this verse is that one possible reason they ask this question is because before this point, they'd been able to cast out demons. We read about that in verse 13 of chapter 6. But in this case, they could not. So Jesus responds in verse 29. What does he say? Say that again, Sandy. You have end fasting there? I do not. Yeah, I don't see why some translations would add fasting. But he is making the point here that this kind cannot come out by anything but prayer. And Dina, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
It's just interesting to me that he's not rebuking them for not having faith. He's just saying they can't go away.
Okay. So he does say, that he doesn't necessarily rebuke them, but he says, how does that answer the question of verse 28? What did the apostles fail to do? Apparently pray. So what does that have to do with their inability to cast it out? They didn't pray, but what does that mean? Right. Exactly. At some point, they were starting to think, well, I can do this. I can do it. They lost sight of the fact that it was Jesus' authority that was allowing them to do that. Now, this is something else we should keep in our minds. Because if we're not careful, we can get on that mindset too. I've been guilty of this, so I'm speaking from my own experience as well. But I hear a lot of sometimes preachers or any Christian say, I converted this person. I did it. I studied the Bible with this person. I baptized them. You hear a lot of that I. And if you're not careful with that, that puts the center on you. I did this. That seems to be the point the apostles reached. I cast all these demons out. I can cast this one out. No, you can't. Because you forgot where you're getting that power from. Therefore, Jesus says, this kind cannot come out by anything but prayer. You have to put the trust in God. It does go back to that lack of faith. A lack of faith is sometimes forgetting where the power is. Lack of faith is forgetting who's in charge. It's not just doubt. Lack of faith is also forgetting who's really in charge. Questions or comments? Yeah, this statement does suggest that. Right. Yeah, this statement does suggest that. That's another good observation to make, that there's different types of unclean spirits that have to be dealt with in different ways. So that's a good point. But Jesus' point here is this one you had to deal with prayer. Not just power, but also putting the power where it belongs, with God. Anything else on verse 29? All right. So, what Jesus says here ultimately refers to the fact that the reason the apostles were unable to cast the unclean spirit out is simply because they had failed to pray. They forgot to put the authority where it belongs, with God. But again, this is all putting this in the context of that question Jesus asked. Another thing the crowd was discussing was whether or not the boy was dead after the unclean spirit was cast out. But it was Jesus' touch that allowed this boy to fully recover from what was happening to him. And we've seen that in a lot of the healing accounts. Is Jesus' touch is what accomplishes the healing of whatever it was. So putting verses 14 through 29 together, everything we've looked at tonight, the point we should be left with is that ultimately the crowd was discussing Jesus and his apostles. They were discussing that the apostles could not cast out the unclean spirit from the boy. They were discussing whether or not Jesus could do it. And finally, they were discussing if the boy was dead after the unclean spirit was cast out. So one application of this to us is that sometimes we ought to be discussing things about Jesus and his apostles. Now, what Mark has recorded in these verses shows us that part of our conversations with each other should revolve around Jesus and his apostles. It's easy to come in and just talk about, hey, how are you? Let's talk about what's going on in the world. As Christians, sometimes our conversations need to be about Jesus, about what we read about him and his apostles, and things of the Bible. Now, what does that accomplish when we're talking about Jesus and things in our normal conversation? Right. When we're talking about Jesus, when we're talking about these things, as Dean put it, it builds us up. It's the principle of iron sharpening iron that we find in the Bible. And so the result of having Jesus involved in our conversations, another thing that accomplishes is bringing us into a closer relationship with him. Again, these are just some applications of what we've studied today. Any other questions or comments? I know we've covered a lot of ground. All right. Jeremiah, will you close us tonight?